Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 49th episode of 2025. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Five for Breakfast. Well, in Washington yesterday, the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation Subcommittee on Telecommunications and Media convened a hearing titled Signal Under Siege, Defending America's Communications Networks. This hearing was focused on the evolving threats and security vulnerabilities facing communications networks. During this hearing, Senators Capito and Fisher both raised the topic of ensuring that the BEAD non-deployment funds are allocated, and the discussions of uses for these funds included cybersecurity and workforce and training. Today at 10 a.m., the House Energy and Commerce Committee will mark up 15 bills, including the bipartisan, bicameral Broadband and Telecommunications Rail Act, creating a pathway towards addressing permitting challenges and the issues of importance for FBA's members. We co-signed the association letter of support for the Rail Act, and it was submitted for the record today. We look forward to working with Senators Blackburn, Senators Lujan, Representatives Joyce and Landman, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle as this legislation advances. Looking ahead to December 17th at 10 a.m., the Senate Commerce Committee will hold a full committee oversight hearing of the FCC with all commissioners scheduled to appear. And as of yesterday, NTI has approved now 29 final BEAD proposals, including those from Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Michigan, Nebraska, New Jersey, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, among the others. So the Fiber Broadband Association applauds the hard work and leadership of our state broadband offices that continue to move BEAD from planning to deployment. Also, please mark your calendars for the Fiber Broadband Association's second annual Public Policy Summit in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday, February 24th. You're not going to want to miss that. And then this weekend, we're going to be all heading to Palm Springs for our Premier Members meeting on December 8th and 9th. This is my favorite event of the year as we reflect on our industry's accomplishments from 2025 and finalize our plans for 2026. So our team's been working very hard on our 26 plan, and I could not be more excited for what we have in store for our members and the industry. 2026 is shaping up to be the best year ever for fiber broadband. And speaking of 2026, FBA will be kicking off our regional Fiber Connect workshops in Oklahoma City on Thursday, February 5th at the Okana Resort with a focus on tribal broadband. So you're not going to want to miss that. Last week on Five for Breakfast, our guest was Roger Entner, the analyst and founder of Recon Analytics, discussed why AI's future depends on fiber. So Roger has this massive bank of consumers that he polls regularly and has uncovered some incredibly important consumer usage data with respect to AI. It turns out that consumers' daily AI usage is perfectly correlated with the quality of your broadband connection. As an example, 75% of fiber subscribers use AI daily. And the study shows as the quality of your connection gets worse, like cable connections have less usage than AI, it drops even further on fixed wireless and even further on DSL. And it's absolutely the lowest. Less than 10% of satellite users use AI daily. Further, Roger's research shows that consumer behavior is quite different for fiber subscribers who spend more time on data-intensive applications such as rich media, gaming, telehealth, and work from home versus those who have lower quality connections like satellite, who do less on their fixed broadband service and more on their phone. So if you missed last week's Five for Breakfast, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Jessica Dine, a policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute, discuss defining digital readiness, what broadband leaders need to know now. So Jessica is a policy analyst at New America's Open Technology Institute and Wireless Future, where she focuses on a range of issues, including broadband access and adoption, spectrum policy, and competition. Jessica previously was a policy analyst at the ITIF, where she focused on broadband policy, particular emphasis on digital literacy, barriers to broadband adoption, and major broadband funding programs. She initially was a research analyst with ITIF and working on the same portfolio. Prior to that, she completed an internship with the House of Representatives and a research internship in technology policy at a multimedia news platform. She holds a BA in economics and philosophy from Grinnell. And with all that, welcome, Jessica, and for audience, please go and we'll work those in discussion. With that, well, welcome to FBA and Fiber for Breakfast, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm so happy to be here.
So tell us, you're going to talk a little bit about some of your recent research paper you issued.
Yes, and I think, yeah, and I think I see a poll up on the screen, and it would be really helpful if now the audience could please take a moment and pick whichever of the choices you think is most true based on your level of awareness of the issue. And so today we're talking about digital skills, and digital skills, as very broadly defined, dictate somebody's ability to benefit from broadband networks. Basically, if we think of broadband as the infrastructure of the digital age, skills are somebody's ability to participate in that digital age. And so they're obviously pivotal. They gate access to online platforms and resources. And AI has already come up 5 minutes into this talk, and in the future and now, they dictate access to AI and even more advanced technologies. So they're so important. And yet I am fairly confident that we will get a scattering of answers on this question. Exactly. And the important thing here is that these results are not at all surprising. And what I'm looking at right now is roughly 60% of respondents guessed around 30% of the population is digitally skilled in the US. Around 37% of respondents guessed around 60%. And the reason some of these answers are varying is that, surprisingly, based on how I've introduced them, based on how pivotal digital skills are to our existence in today's information age, at least in the US, we don't have a coherent method of defining them. We don't even have coherent language to describe them. You know, digital skills, literacy, competence, all overlap, all mean somewhat different things in somewhat different contexts, but can all be used to describe the same idea. So we don't have a shared language around them. We certainly don't have a shared method of measuring them or checking people's actual skill levels. And I'm talking about at a national level. And there's a lot of great work going on based on upskilling people at the local and state level. And much of this work, which I'm sure we'll get into later in the conversation, does necessarily have to happen at the more local level. But it's a big oversight for there to be no consistent trends at the national level, no clear understanding of where the US is in terms of digital skills and what we're aiming for. And so that's what our research is based on.
Well, great. Hey, just to kind of start off, you know, you went to Grinnell, right? So you left the cozy Washington, D.C. area to go out to Iowa to do your education. So my favorite Grinnell alumni of all times is a young lady named Meg Huey. You didn't happen to run into Meg, did you?
Don't think so, no.
Okay. I was on the board for Teach for America, and she was my first teacher I adopted, and she was wonderful. So I have great things to, you know, warm thoughts about Grinnell and their graduates. So, hey, so just kind of getting going. When I read through your paper, you know, you cite out that you know, people that have developed digital skills are paid 23% more than those without. But I think even more importantly is that you cite that 92% of all jobs across the nation require digital skills. So basically, if you want a job, you need to have some digital skills. Can you talk a little bit more about that and kind of what some of the key metrics that, you know, why does it matter?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the front, I should say that's research I was citing that came out of the National Skills Coalition that does some great work on this issue area. So exactly like you said, they found a few years ago, I am very confident the number is higher by now, that 92% of jobs required at least some digital skills. They also found that workers that are eligible, that are able to get a job that requires some digital skills, see their average income increase by around 23%, like you said, which is around $8,000 per year. So that's enormous, especially when we're talking about an individual. And then there's also, you know, the thing is, it's hard to conceptualize or actually quantify the benefits of digital upskilling on a national level. And ironically, it's hard because they are so ubiquitous. It's even hard to quantify the benefits of connectivity. We've definitely seen papers trying to do it, and some have been very successful. But connectivity underlies every facet of our participation in society. It gates access to every different field and every resource. It's exceptionally difficult to figure out what precise number we're seeing when we go from having no broadband access to broadband access. And digital skills underpin that. Digital skills are the other barrier to broadband connectivity when somebody has access to a network. So I think one of the complicated things is how to quantify the value of digital upskilling. I did recently see some very interesting research out of Benton, actually, that looked at it in terms of a wellness index. They talked about, and I think some of the original research came back to Comcast, but also was from John Horrigan, who's at Benton. They basically looked at how much somebody's quality of life, which is a really good way of looking at it. I think it really encapsulates how broad and ubiquitous digital skills are. They determine your quality of life. There's no way around it. So they looked at the increase in somebody's quality of life. And then there was separate research that talked about financial benefits of that amount of increase in quality of life. So what I'm getting at is there's no one number, and there definitely won't be for a while, that can quantify the benefits of digital skills. But the reason for that is that they're absolutely ubiquitous and they're an integral part of quality of life.
So why now? All right. So why is a national digital skills framework critical at this moment, especially, with the federal broadband investment peaking, in this, coming in 2026?
Yeah. So when I wrote the paper, which was a little while back, but it remains evergreen, the situation was slightly different. The reason it is more critical now than ever, well, there are two reasons. First of all, like you said, BEAD, which really impossible not to mention. Right now, in BEAD alone, just as a large deployment program example, we're funneling at least $20 billion through the BEAD program to finish deployment. And so if we do that, and we don't put energy into shoring up our digital skills, which, like I've explained already, are essentially our digital readiness levels and our ability to benefit from those broadband networks that we build, we're not really doing enough or anything to ensure maximum benefits from the networks that we're building, because adoption is the biggest component of the digital divide. Affordability is huge. Deployment itself is huge, but a huge percentage of people who are offline because of some kind of skills or knowledge barrier. And if we don't try to address all these barriers at once, we'll have solved half the problem and not the other half. So if we want BEAD to succeed, and again, BEAD at its core and the federal policy at its core is about connecting people. Deployment is part of that equation, but it's not the whole thing. We need to ensure that people are actually connecting to the networks that are connecting to their houses. And the reason it has become even more critical now is actually because of the programs and policies that aren't being followed through on. So BEAD is happening. It, of course, saw some changes over the summer, but for now, we're going to see how it runs through. The end goal is still to deploy broadband to everyone. But the programs that aren't being followed through on right now, I am talking about two sources of funds in particular: the Digital Equity Act, of course, and what you already mentioned, BEAD's non-deployment funds, which were the remainder of BEAD funds after deployment is finished, that Congress initially allocated to states to do what they wanted with, essentially fulfill non-deployment use cases. And both of those programs would have funded things like broadband affordability programs for disseminating devices, and what we're talking about today, digital upskilling and digital navigation programs. And equally relevant to our conversation right now on the framework itself, funding recipients for those programs would have needed to measure and track progress made by winning programs, which means we would have had at least one huge initial source of data on our current digital skill levels, barriers to access, and what kinds of interventions work as we were able to follow the trends over time. And I'm not going to speak to the future, but at least for now, the current administration has halted both of those programs. So going back to what I said about BEAD, without DEA and non-deployment, right now at a federal level, we're building networks without funding the programs that would actually ensure the return on these $20 billion, this massive investment that's supposed to be future looking. And we're not doing anything to track and measure the programs that do exist, those great local and state level programs that are trying to make a dent in the skills gap. And so all of this, it's an incoherent landscape, and it's a problem.
So, okay, so it's clear that Commerce is not interested in using non-deployment funds for digital literacy, digital equity. So where does that burden fall? Now, I mean, for example, when we were in DC talking about Leo, for example, the way the BEAD program set up is that, Kuiper, or I say Amazon Leo and Starlink don't receive a penny of their BEAD allocations unless they get subscribers. So is the burden, so we have 1 million unserved, underserved rural Americans that are relegated to LEO satellite. So is it the burden on those satellite providers to help provide digital literacy training, digital equity training, or is it on the broadband offices to find funding other ways, or other ISPs, or who? I mean, obviously, you can't go to a parish in Louisiana, in Northeast Louisiana, who never participated in the internet and say, okay, now you have your fiber connection or your LEO connection, you're good to go, right? I mean, we saw that with the rural electrification is you can't, provide electricity and say, okay, you got electricity house, you need to let them know that, okay, this is what a light bulb is, this is what a refrigerator and appliances, and these are the things you can do with it, right? So who's this burden fall on?
I think it has to fall on everybody. And I think part of it is that it's a shared issue that affects everybody. And part of it is that addressing it benefits at least all stakeholders, like take broadband providers or technology vendors. Digital upskilling and any kind of adoption work, when you think about it, is really shoring up interest in their product or use of their product. So it's kind of a given that they should at least be interested in it. I also think broadband providers are uniquely positioned to provide things like tech support. However, they are not the end all be all. And part of that is that, there is a wealth of research on what kind of digital skills and navigation programs and just inclusion interventions in general work. And a lot of the time it comes down to trusted local people in small local communities who are really able to provide individualized service and address the immediate needs of their community members. And, a bigger ISP is not always going to be able to fill that role. There's also the question of data. And that is important, I think, particularly in this context, because we need data on the issue to be able to, you can't solve a problem if you're not able to measure it. So to start, we need widespread data on the issue of skill levels across the US and barriers that are not related to deployment across the US, so that we have a clear conception of where interventions are needed. And I would say ISPs are not necessarily who I'd look to collect that data, because it's really important to balance privacy concerns with the need for a holistic understanding of this issue. And maybe to the degree that ISPs participate in and stand up digital equity programs, they could allow users to voluntarily report their data, and which is something that any digital inclusion org should do. I'm talking about things like entry and exit surveys, which consumers might fill out upon entering the organization, describe their needs that they're coming in with, and then once they leave, they might describe how those needs have been addressed and what kinds of interventions were helpful to them. But really, what we need from ISPs is accurate numbers on availability and cost and network quality, so we can go from there and figure out which access gaps are caused by something that is not a deployment issue or not an infrastructure issue. So everybody has a role to play. And, there's a lot that's said about the networked model of digital inclusion, which is every institution around an individual working collaboratively to help connect that individual. Very trusted institutions like libraries also play a huge role in terms of finding the funding itself. One mechanism that we've been thinking about, especially at OTI, and I know in a few other groups, is the Universal Service Fund. Because at this point, BEAD was a one-time, and even DEA were essentially one-time infusions of funds. USF is a continuing mechanism. And again, going back to what I said before, USF is about connecting people. And today, it's very clear based on the data that connecting people means addressing adoption gaps, at least as much as it means addressing deployment gaps. And within those adoption gaps, a lot of them are being driven by digital skills gaps. So, we're still working out our exact thoughts on what this could look like, but it seems that USF would be a natural fit for a new arm based on adoption, with maybe a digital upskilling mechanism within that.
USF is limited to rate of return carriers. So it's just a subset of the overall
absolutely
base that we're addressing.
Again, addressing only part of the issue, but we're trying to figure out how many different programs and institutions can get involved, and while we chip away at the issue and try to better understand it.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, so should the state broadband offices all look and see, this is a metric that they should be tracking by their award recipients? And
I think many of them already are. We did have digital equity plans that came out of the Digital Equity Act when it was initially stood up. So we've got a lot of good data out there. Many of them do have more detailed surveys. Some ended up relying on census data. I think yes, they should, because the U.S. is always going to take a decentralized approach to this kind of data. I mean, even with education data, a lot of it's collected and standardized at the state level, not the federal level. So I think I'm hesitant to put more of a burden on state broadband offices that I know are already under-resourced and probably overworked, but I also have a lot of faith in their ability to collect the kind of data they need. So those that aren't, I think state broadband offices are one group that should be focusing a little more specifically on digital skill levels.
Well, in the past, I've had Harvard's behavioral science researchers on, and they have a strong correlation between patient outcomes, especially when we're during COVID and so forth. But they're able to use just your standard smartphone to track sleep and the activity behaviors with their mental health patients, and be able to have better outcomes. And the way they do this is they have very intensive digital literacy training so that their patients know how to use the phone and be able to make sure that their data is being tracked, because when you can measure something, you can always have a better outcome. So if we disaggregate this to very specific applications, so that obviously if you are working on mental health and you're highly motivated to try to do this, or different applications versus just kind of sending out, and if we do that disaggregated, how do we be able to, can you kind of talk about standardization and ways to measure this digital competency across all these states and programs? Because that's the other thing, is BEAD is one of many programs. Right?
Yes. Yeah, well, that's exactly what makes this so hard. First of all, because, the broadband landscape in general, like you just said, is so complicated and has so many facets. And then also because digital skills themselves have so many facets. And then also because digital upskilling necessarily needs to happen very flexibly and on a very individualized personal level. And like I mentioned before, is most successful, which has been proven time and time again when it addresses the timely needs of participants as they arise. There's really no other way about it. Standardization, if done too vehemently, would definitely be a negative. So I think when you're talking about a framework, the important thing is to balance flexibility, that flexibility that I'm talking about, which allows for disparate implementation across the country and within various fields, with enough specificity to encourage standardization of terms of measurement and goals. And that is why a lot of the example frameworks that I've seen don't really get into particular tasks that people need to complete. Say they're outlining the abilities that somebody who is digitally skilled needs. A lot of the time they actually talk about personality traits, almost basically broad competencies that they've figured out will enable the person to both participate today on like various platforms in various fields digitally, and also importantly, personality traits that will allow them to progress as technology progresses, because that is the, I think, fourth reason that these frameworks really need to balance flexibility with specificity. Technology will progress, and you really don't want something that's going to become obsolete in a couple of years. And so in terms of the actual data that needs to be collected, at a more local level, you're talking about things like what kinds of skills need to be measured. And that definitely varies by industry, varies by application. how those skills could be measured. You can maybe think about self-reported data, which can be incredibly useful, and especially with adults is sometimes just the best method, but comes with some of its own issues. You don't know what you don't know. So certain groups or people of certain skill levels may self-report differently than members of other groups or skill levels. And then the way to standardize that data is really to figure out what the overarching themes are that encompass various tasks and needs and kind of fit them within them so that it makes sense, if that made sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a really good question that came in is, why do you think members of Congress, state legislatures, and governors have not, in general, embraced the key role of digital skills and literacy plans in improving economic and personal growth and achievement in their communities? And what needs to be done to find legislative solutions, or members that are open for this kind of work?
That is a great question. I don't really want to, I can't really speak for the people who've made these decisions, so I can't really speak to their motivations. I'll say from my perspective, first of all, digital skills sometimes appear easy to overlook because they're so baked into everything. You don't even necessarily think of them as their own issue. It's baked within adoption or just broadband use in general. And when you're thinking about broadband, especially someone who doesn't often think about the topic, it might feel easier and more natural to throw money at deploying more networks and ensuring they're high quality than it does to kind of shore up the more local level inclusion orgs that are sometimes not even really clear. It's sometimes not clear that a digital upskilling org is a digital upskilling org because they can be things like social service agencies, libraries, places that you wouldn't automatically think and that aren't solely focused on that. So part of it is how disseminated the field is, broadly disseminated, and how hard it can be to locate. I think the other part of it is that the government has gotten a little bit ahead of itself. And I mean, the administration is now very excited about AI use. So I wouldn't say they're never interested in digital skills. I'm not hearing in a lot of their language that they're registering that digital skills are the baseline necessary for AI skills. So there might be a way to slip digital upskilling into any future legislation that comes out around AI upskilling. I think that's my best hope at this point. In terms of what needs to be done, well, within the scope of this report, one thing that I think would help would be interest in a national framework. And I think that would help because if we could have, right now it's very hard to really understand the scale of the problem because at a national level, we really have no idea what US skill levels are. So I think if we had some kind of framework and that helped us generate even very rough numbers that approximate the size and scale of the problem and figure out how many Americans are underskilled and how many are offline because they're underskilled, that might be a way to elicit federal funding. It's a lot more powerful to point to the US population and say 40%, and this is a made up number, but 40% of the US population is underskilled. And of course, if we could have studies that came out that showed the dollar impact of that would be even more powerful.
I think. I was going to say it's, last week with the Recon research on AI and the correlation with fiber and so forth. One of the other things that came out of Roger's research is that these different generative AI tools, we see now this whole red alert from Sam Altman and, that now the Gemini is overtaking ChatGPT and Roger had a whole heat map of all the different tools and what they're best used for. And I've been kind of using, a ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot, wasn't mapping the task to the tool. And so it seems like, to make it more relevant to, because when you look at, we see a lot of like even ex-FCC members that don't think rural America really need anything more than 15.3 and speeds and things like that. If we just kind of roll it all into AI literacy, because I don't think there's anybody on the planet that really understands. I mean, it changes daily on what the capabilities of each of these generative AI tools can do and what they're best used for and all the different use cases. And so this is, very relevant to everybody in the country. And, we could just roll this all together, because to be able to use AI tools, you have to use a broadband network, and to understand the broadband network, you need to have digital literacy. So it seems like you could roll it all together, and it would be fit the administration's, top objectives of, being able to have global AI leadership. And, just kind of throwing out from this discussion, it seems like that might be a path forward.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think that's potentially the most likely path forward. And that's not even a divergence from what I think of as digital skills. Digital skills are the ability to use whatever technology and whatever platforms you need to use. And not quite yet. AI isn't quite vital to our participation in society yet, but it's getting there, and it is going to be soon. So I think it's really important to remember that digital skills grow and change with the time. Yeah. And they definitely encompass AI at this point. And to use AI, you need to be able to turn on your computer.
Well, and I like the definition of, tying. This is all about being able to leverage technology to improve quality of life. So whether it's just being able to do a basic email, to being able to do a telehealth session, to being able to understand what generative AI chatbot is going to be able to serve the best purpose. And, if we're going to really, because, whenever time you have one of these paradigm shifts, you try to look to the past and say, okay, what have I done in the past, and how do I use this tool? Well, what always happens is you realize what you've done in the past doesn't matter anymore, because, the paradigm shift enables a whole new set of behaviors. And so you don't have to try to automate the stuff of the past. You can do all kinds of amazing new things in the future. And so it's that pivot that we're right now in the cusp of this paradigm shift into this kind of amazing AI, and I'll call it quantum networking, metaverse, and all the things that, fiber is enabling. So it's just exciting time. And, a few short years from now, it's kind of like, you hit a button and summons Uber. No one thinks twice about that. Or even, when I was in Houston earlier this year, and the Waymos are coming in, driverless Jaguars are coming in, and they're all look like, novice drivers, kind of, all freaking out being overwhelmed with all the sensors. And then, I'm in Scottsdale, and they come gliding in with all this traffic, seamlessly pick up passengers and off. And you're in a few short months, the ability for a Waymo to actually look like something that you're not going to get killed in is, amazing. And, and I think these things will just be in a few short months, a few short years, all, be just being able to use your GPS or any of the things that we just, are so used to now. So anyway, I could talk to you for forever, Jessica. I always enjoy talking to you. I love your perspective on things, and I really appreciate your research.
Of course.
So thanks for joining us today. And thanks everybody for joining us. I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. My good friend, Dr. Christopher Alley from Penn State, is going to be here to discuss what's next after beads. I always love talking to Chris, and I hope to see a lot of you guys in Palm Springs in a few days for the Premier member meeting. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you guys either this weekend or next week.